outcome through dialogue, through talking and listening to each other, rather than experiencing the adversarial, often very divisive and damaging effects of grievance processes, which in many cases make situations worse, polarize the parties, and actually create more harm than good. So today we're going to help you take the grief out of grievances. As Alan suggested, we'll look at the role that mediation and resolution process are playing within Royal Mail Group. We have another case study from Winchester City Council, and we're excited to have Paul Latreille talking about his experiences of whole systems approaches. So here's a little word cloud of conflict. Conflicts go by many names within organisations. At one end of the spectrum, falling out, not seeing eye to eye, disagreements, some of those are challenging situations that we often expect our managers and leaders to be able to resolve. Often they find it difficult to resolve those because they haven't necessarily been equipped with the skills, or the competence, or the confidence that they need to be able to address those issues. So as the conflict escalates, we start to hear the language of grievance, bullying, harassment, discrimination. And then we start to see a significant breakdown in relations between the parties. Trenches get dug, heels get dug in, people take a position, often the position of right, I'm right, you're wrong, I win, you lose. And people's experience then of dispute resolution is they want to use a process to demonstrate that they're right, and in some respects to humiliate or punish the other party. And of course that's why we start to see our grievance processes, bullying and harassment policies kicking in. And as they fail, as invariably they so often do, the language starts to break down even further, and we start to see high levels of stress, significant breakdown in relations between the parties. We start to hear language of employment tribunals, early conciliation, settlement agreements. And the question that people always ask me at the end of the process when I'm working with them, I'm a mediator of 20 years, and the parties say to me at the end of this process, why did we not do something earlier? Why could we not get around the table with the help of a skilled third party to help find a solution? And my role as a mediator, and the work that we do at the TCM Group, is help to embed a culture of dialogue, a culture of collaboration, where parties can find an opportunity to come together and have a conversation with each other to find a satisfactory outcome, at the very same time where organisations traditionally rely on a system or a process which is intrinsically adversarial. So today we'll be focusing on the resolution policy as an alternative to the grievance procedure, helping parties to find mutually acceptable outcomes through dialogue. When relationships break down, there are significant outcomes for the individuals. There's a high level of uncertainty. What does this mean? What does this mean for me going forward? That leads to confusion. We experience a sense of fear, anxiety. The fight or flight response can be profound for ourselves. We perhaps become suspicious of the other person. We see the breakdown of trust and confidence in the other person. We can experience that as stress, as anxiety, as trauma, as individuals. And that can then lead us to perhaps form little cliques and alliances with people we think may agree with our point of view. We start to see division experiencing within teams as these cliques start to form camps. People become disengaged. If we can take on board the work of Nita Clark and David McLeod, they tell us that only 30% of our workforce is engaged at any one time. I would suggest that unresolved conflicts and disputes are a major driver of disengagement within our modern workplaces. And of course, the very pernicious and damaging rumours and gossip. When I speak to managers, they often tell me the most difficult aspect of managing the team is when the team breaks down and then they cannot get a grip on the gossip and the rumours that exist within those teams. So this is what happens when we have a relationship breakdown. Now, when I was at a focus group yesterday at a large university, I was talking to a number of key stakeholders from within the university, and we'd run a large survey of the workforce within that university. And you know what the people in that survey said as part of their response that they wanted when they experienced a conflict or a dispute? What they said, they wanted to hear the other person's point of view. That was the overwhelming leading response from people in the survey. Now, when we experience these relationship breakdowns and the desire to have our voice heard and to hear the voice of the other person, the question for you as HR professionals and leaders within your organisation is, where is the facility? Where do you ensure that the parties in a conflict can come together to find a satisfactory outcome, to have their voice heard, and to, of course, hear the other person's point of view? When we experience relationship breakdown, we don't start off by wanting to humiliate the other person, to damage them, to punish them, for there to be retribution. But that's what it ends up to look like we may want, because the grievance process drives those kind of behaviours. And I would suggest that organisations who have a grievance procedure actually promote and encourage negative behaviour by the employees. In fact, the root cause of destructive behaviour by a great many of your employees are the very policies that you have in place to help to design to help resolve those issues. There's a paradox, and this is an opportunity to address that. So our systems for resolving disputes within our organisations are reactive. We have to press a button. We have to make something happen in order for the policy to start. They react to circumstances. Rather than managers, leaders, HR professionals and others spotting tensions, being intuitive and understanding some of the challenges and clashes that might arise out of a change programme within teams and within groups. We have to start a grievance process. What I find particularly peculiar in a great many organisations is something I've heard a lot of recently, is the threat of taking out grievance. If this carries on, I'll take a grievance out against you. As though that's a threat. I will invoke the very procedure that's designed to resolve our dispute is a threat. How does that work? And something I've heard a lot of also very recently, and it concerns me enormously. If this continues, I'm going to go to HR. As though that's a threat. Surely going to HR is the absolute best possible thing we can do. Securing a positive relationship with our HR professional who can act as a coach, as a mentor, supporting managers and employees to have conversations and dialogue. When I speak to HR professionals or I look at the CIPD HR profession map, the HR professional as the enemy isn't my reading of modern HR, yet our policies and procedures create or perpetuate the perception by employees and managers that going to HR is in some respects threatening. So the policy itself is an adversarial policy. And of course the adversarial nature of disputes, the I win, you lose approach to conflict resolution is proven to be ineffective in resolving outcomes. We want to help the parties identify a win-win outcome, something that's mutually acceptable, but the policy framework that exists does not encourage win-win outcomes or interest-based negotiations. In fact, what they actually do is they polarize the parties. As soon as we start to write our grievance down, as soon as we start to formalize it, we adopt the positions, and they are on polar opposites. They're right, wrong, win, lose. And in doing so, get into the root of the conflict. I've suggested that there are 7 deadly sins as a result of conflict. Each of those has a direct root cause. Well, grievance procedures and formal adversarial systems for dispute resolution do not examine the root cause of conflict. They do not encourage a level of change, understanding, ongoing learning and continuous improvement in our relationships. They're used as a stick to beat each other with. Surely this isn't good for our business. Surely this isn't good for the individuals in our companies. Surely this is holding us back and failing to meet the needs of the modern business. This, after all, is not a time for business as usual. And a reliance on an outmoded and anachronistic system for dispute resolution, in many respects, is actually holding back our organisations, impeding creativity, creating a culture within our organisations where we're more focused on grievance, entitlement and litigation and rights and wrongs than we are about working collaboratively to achieve the objectives and needs of our business to secure better business outcomes. And interestingly, where HR professionals are making a shift from a grievance culture to a resolution policy, what they're saying to me is, David, this is underpinning the Ulrich principles. We want to drive hard business objectives. But actually, part of that is about promoting dialogue within our organisations. The grievance procedure actually impedes the ability to embed the Ulrich principles within our organisation. Therefore, we see often an Ulrich light or some variation on Ulrich. So here's a couple of charts. This is based on some training I ran recently where I asked the group to tell me that some words that came to mind when I put up these 2 flip charts, grievance and resolution, and I thought I'd share it with you. This is the language of grievance. This is the grievance procedure that you choose to have in your organisation. This is what people are saying about your procedure. It's formal, it's judgmental, it's draconian, it's combative, it's about win-lose, it's argument. That wouldn't look very nice in the front of the reception room of most organisations, and it certainly clashes directly with the values of most of our organisations. Resolution informal, collaboration, non-adversarial, open, consensus, win-win. This is aligning itself much more clearly to the values, the principles, the vision, the ethos of the modern organisation. So why do we choose grievance? I'm not sure. There are some real hard figures out there in relation to conflicts and disputes, and we'll hear from Paul Latreille shortly about his experiences as an academic of thinking of the whole systems approach, which I'm a huge fan of when we're thinking about conflict management. But the one I like the most is number 3 here, undertaken by an organisation called CEDAR. A third of managers would sooner jump out of a plane for the first time than deal with a problem at work. Well, given the amount of time and energy that's spent, surely we should be looking at our managers and upskilling them to be able to have difficult conversations, critical conversations, to be able to find positive outcomes and secure better resolutions. Surely it's not good for our business that our managers would prefer to jump out of a plane than deal with some of the real issues that happen in our organisations and are happening right now in our businesses. So we're going to run a little poll here. So you have to, we're going to hand over to Ammon, who's going to run the poll. I'm going to ask you to think about, from your point of view, do grievance procedures work? So I'm going to flip over to Ammon, and he's going to run the poll. So the poll is open. Okay, so we'll be able to report back some of the outcome of that poll shortly, and we'll be able to see the results of that poll in a short while once we hand back to Ammon. But for now, what I'd like to do is hand to Paul Latreille, who's going to share with us some of his experiences of developing whole systems approaches to conflict resolution. Oh, hang on, I think we're just sharing the poll results as we speak. Okay, Ammon, is there anything in there that you can share with us in terms of your analysis? Okay.
Okay, looking at the poll, it seems like we have a little bit more work to do. We have people that believe that grievance procedures work is 8%. People that believe that grievance procedures do not work is 37%, and the people who remain undecided and think that grievance procedures maybe work is at 55%. Thank you very much for your votes, people. That's really, really interesting. Right, I will now hand over to Paul Latreille from the Sheffield University Management School.
Hi everyone. I should just clarify something David said a little bit earlier, which is I'm going to talk less about my experience of sort of whole systems conflict management, and rather a bit more about some of the academic work that's been happening around that. This is something that's still very much new, I think, to the UK context, so a lot of what I'll talk about is based on the US. I'm going to take it for granted that everyone here is already familiar with the basic idea of mediation and its use in the workplace context, but I want to talk about 2 things in my 10 minutes. The first of those is really a quick skim over the evidence on mediation, just to kind of situate things, and then to float the idea that dealing with conflict more effectively might require us to think about sitting mediation within a wider systems approach to conflict management. As an academic, it's worth noting, I think, that there's a growing body of evidence about mediation's role and its impact in that setting, and indeed in a variety of other contexts too. Much of that evidence, I think, to date has been from the US. There's some very interesting work that Lisa Bingham's been involved in over a number of years now on the introduction of what's called transformative mediation at the US Postal Service. But there's a nascent body of evidence emerging in the UK, including a series of CIPD surveys on conflict at work and its management or resolution, and also I think some interesting findings emerging from some academic case studies of organisations. The latter, the case studies, are summarised in 2 thematic reviews that have been published in the ACAS research paper series over the last few years. The first one was one that I was responsible for putting together and was published I think 3 or 4 years ago now, which looked at 8 early adopters of workplace mediation. The second of the thematic reviews, which is by Richard Saundry and Gemma Wibberley, published earlier this year, looks more broadly at individual conflict and the resolution of disputes in a slightly smaller sample of 5 organisations, but again including mediation. And there's some interesting findings that emerge from that, but thinking about the evidence more broadly, I think it suggests a set of fairly well established, although arguably not fully quantified, business benefits from mediation. So they would include things like high success rates. David, I think, mentioned a little bit earlier about the high success rates that mediation delivers. The organisations that we've been involved in looking at, they typically run at something like 75% or more, and indeed in many organisations we're looking at 80 to 90% resolution. One needs to be a little bit cautious about that finding. There is the potential for what are called selection effects in the academic literature. So the parties to mediation essentially self-select themselves into the process by agreeing to volunteer to take part, and that may indicate a predisposition towards wanting resolution rather than perhaps the punishment that David mentioned earlier. And there's also, I think, organisational screening around the types of issues or cases that actually go forward. But nonetheless, I think it's fair to say that those sorts of resolution rates are extremely encouraging and do point to a very positive picture. It's worth noting too that participants, generally in kind of exit evaluations, report high levels of satisfaction with both the process and indeed mediators, as well as with the outcomes that are arrived at on the day. It has positive benefits too in relation to speed, so I think, as David mentioned earlier, it's typically a much faster process than discipline and grievance processes are. It's also typically found to involve lower cost, although perhaps the cost is perhaps in some cases a bit more upfront, particularly if you're using an external mediator, rather than being a hidden cost, which I think is often the case with discipline and grievance processes, where they're essentially staff that you're already employing, so you don't actually see the additional cost in the first instance. The savings can be quite significant. East Lancs Primary Care Trust, for example, in a case study, indicated savings of around £230,000 a year on fairly conservative estimates. Small compared to the overall budget, but nonetheless quite a sizable amount. Other benefits include the fact that, as David has indicated, relationships can potentially be preserved. There's lower turnover, therefore potentially arising as a result of difficulties between employees. And it's also a confidential process, and I think one of the benefits that American authors like Lipsky and Sieber have pointed to is the sense that it helps keep issues within the organisation rather than airing them in public, which is what happens if you go to an employment tribunal. I think perhaps more fundamentally on the benefit side, the government's claim that a growth in the use of mediation has the potential to lead to a major and dramatic shift in the culture of employment relations. And there is some evidence from Richard Saundry's case study, East Lancs PCT, that mediation can act as a catalyst in developing trust between unions and managers and facilitating informal processes of resolution. I think it's fair to say, though, that we do need more research on this. There are, I think, also some challenges. A recent ACAS policy paper that Richard, myself, and a number of other contributors to a recent ESRC seminar series, of which TCM was one of the co-sponsors, that policy paper pointed to a number of challenges. Those include potential perceptions of an obligation to participate and indeed in some instances to settle on the part of parties to mediation. Some concerns in some instances around the sustainability or resilience of the outcomes, especially when the issues concern performance. And I think it's probably worth noting that that may reflect the fact that often mediation is used as a last resort. It's at a very late stage in the process rather than when a dispute might be regarded as more ripe, where the parties have recognised they've reached what's termed a hurting stalemate. Other challenges include some evidence of resistance from managers and employee reps. The managers particularly potentially seeing mediation as undermining their authority or being in some sense an admission of failure. And also, I think David mentioned earlier about managers not being skilled, and I think that really is one of the biggest challenges that's been evidenced in a number of places, including CIPD data, around limited managerial skills in handling and managing conflict and confidence to do the same. And that's come out of a number of the case studies, for example, as described in the Saundry and Wibberley research paper in the ACAS series most recently. And strikingly, they found also limited evidence of widespread attempts to systematically upskill managers to cope with their new responsibilities. So there is, I think, some more work to be done, but on balance, I think it's clear to say that the evidence around mediation is very positive. I think there's more limited evidence of its impact on broader organisational culture, although there are one or two interesting case studies emerging where this does seem to have happened. So I say, on balance, I think it's fair to say the evidence is positive, notwithstanding, I think, the challenges that exist. But I think it's at least potentially worth thinking about the fact that mediation is just one approach to resolving conflict or handling conflict at work. And I've argued in a number of fora recently, there's a sense in which we're thinking about mediation as a bit like Maslow's hammer. And to quote Maslow, he says, it's tempting if the only tool you have is a hammer to treat everything as if it were a nail. And so I've been arguing more recently that we perhaps need to think about other tools in the toolkit where they might be appropriate for a job in hand. The idea, of course, ultimately, as I think David's discussion suggested, was that we need to resolve issues at the lowest level and at the earliest stage that we can. I'd also like to suggest, and it's really only a suggestion at this stage, that as our ACAS policy piece has argued, these wider cultural benefits from mediation are much more likely to apply if we shift the focus on conflict and its management from being of a more transactional nature, with a focus on settlement, to a strategic matter. So we're focusing on broader organisational performance and the way in which conflict impacts on organisational performance. So this is really the sort of second bit I want to talk about fairly briefly, is what are those more systematic approaches to conflict handling? And here the literature is very much US focused. They're clearly ahead of the UK in this area. And there's been developed this idea of an integrated conflict management system that's gained traction in the US. Dave Lipsky, I came across a presentation of his on the internet recently. Dave Lipsky is a professor at Cornell University's Scheiman Institute on Conflict Resolution, and he's noted that a number of organisations, very prominent organisations, have what might be described as conflict management systems, including Coca-Cola, Netflix, Yahoo, 3M, General Motors and Hewlett-Packard. So the idea is definitely getting traction on that side of the Atlantic. So what is an integrated conflict management system? Well, according to Lynch, it's, and here I'll quote, a comprehensive systems approach to the prevention, management and resolution of conflict, changing the philosophy and in many cases the terminology of organisational life. So while mediation can be part of an ICMS, an integrated conflict management system, it doesn't constitute a system in its own right, since it doesn't really contribute, at least directly, to the front end of disputing, in other words, the more preventative end. So in theory, at least, ICMSs share a number of key characteristics. First is that they're all-encompassing. They cover the full range of potential issues, discipline and grievance, as well as looser sort of interpersonal issues. They focus on developing a conflict-competent culture in which issues get surfaced and conflict is recognised as having potentially positive as well as negative effects. And that follows the idea in Pondi's seminal work back in the late 1960s that conflict can be functional and therefore have positive outcomes as well as dysfunctional when it has negative outcomes. and a focus on appropriately and proactively managing that conflict. And I think David talked earlier about the fact that typically conflict is dealt with in a very reactive way, and ICMS very much shifts the focus towards being proactive. There are, within an ICMS, multiple access points, so individuals can enter from various routes and at various stages of a conflict, switching in and out of formal versus less formal approaches. There are a range of options and choice, so multiple flexible approaches to conflict, including a much wider dispute resolution toolkit than simply mediation, and encompassing both interests and rights-based approaches. So we might think about additional bits in the toolkit, including conflict coaching, peer evaluation of disputes, the use of executive panels to make decisions, the use of arbitration, or more formal open door policies. There's a range of different options there. And the other thing that constitutes a system, and I think this is something that hasn't yet really been picked up in some of the empirical work, is that there's a set of support structures. So championing of the project by organizational leaders, developing a critical mass of trained people within the organization, particularly managers, giving them basic conflict resolution skills, a toolkit and a language for dealing with conflict, education and awareness programs, provision of incentives for appropriate management of conflict, and so on. So the key really here is to move from a focus on a reactive resolution based approach to one which is much more about prevention, then early intervention, managing the problem, and then as necessary going through resolution type processes. And I think implicit within that is a recognition that conflict, or dealing with conflict effectively, is likely to be a key driver for employee health and well-being, and ultimately for organizational performance. How much traction that's got, as I say, in the US, some survey work of Fortune 1000 companies found that around a third of those organizations had adopted features which were consistent with a conflict management system. Again, that's the work of people like Dave Lipsky. However, that typically occurred in relatively high-road organizations, those which have very positive organizational practices in other areas. I think that's likely to be true of some of the emerging case study evidence in the UK. Again, it tends to be high-road organisations that are moving towards this. As I said, we're seeing a little bit of evidence that this might be getting some traction. And I suspect that Royal Mail, and I think we're going to hear about that in a minute, is one example where they're adopting more innovative approaches, and I think crucially where they're going to be evaluating the introduction of this scheme in a very rigorous way. In conjunction with a group of academics, including myself, which will, I think, give us some really good evidence on this for the first time in the UK. In closing, I think, and just on a slightly more cautionary note, I don't know whether David said, but I am actually an economist by training, and we're not for nothing known as dismal scientists. It's fair to say that it's actually proven harder, I think, to find evidence yet for Great Britain and Ireland around the use of a conflict management system approach beyond these early signs that perhaps it's getting a little bit of gain, or indeed their efficacy. There's some work that Bill Roach and Paul Teague have done, published in 2012, and I'll quote the finding here, which is that while proactive line management and supervisory engagement in conflict resolution as a key dimension of conflict management systems is found to be positively associated with a range of organisational outcomes, no evidence is found for the kind of system effects proposed in the theoretical and prescriptive literature. I think it's worth saying in closing, though, that their modelling is very much about the availability of that range, the sorts of options that I mentioned a minute ago, rather than of a more fully encompassing system. And of course, the sorts of systemic effects we've been talking about may take much longer to manifest. It's difficult to see how a more systematic approach won't deliver positive outcomes. I think it's early days yet, and measuring those things is much more challenging. And as I said, it's possible that Royal Mail Group will provide the first such evidence at that time.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. That was excellent. Thank you for that presentation. I'm now going to hand over to Megan Glass, who will be talking about Royal Mail and how they have changed from an adversarial culture to a collaborative culture. And please can I remind people to ask questions at the Q&A session at the end of this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan. So we're just pulling up the slides now. And so what we have is a case study from Royal Mail in which they have begun a mediation service in response to bullying and harassment cases. So first off, so why mediation? Well, first there was a shift of opinion within the industry and from the unions as well of wanting to move from formal and adversarial ways of resolving workplace conflict to more collaborative dispute resolution process. There were existing, and the reason why is because there were existing issues within Royal Mail previous bullying and harassment policy, which included things like it polarized individuals, didn't bring them together. It really rarely worked to solve the root cause of the issue, and both individual and business needs were sometimes ignored. And this is what we here at TCM find with truly all bullying and harassment and general grievance procedures as well. They tend to be adversarial, as David was mentioning. They are meant to be a resolution, a way to bring people to end the dispute. And in reality, they're pitting each other against, pitting people against each other. So what Royal Mail was looking for was a way to reduce the cost for the business in terms of time taken to investigate cases and to address absence rates due to stress, etc. And mediation was seen as the solution and the alternative to these formal investigation processes. So when introducing mediation, what were the challenges and the solutions? So the first challenge for Royal Mail was securing the buy-in of the business. And this was done by presenting a strong business case. And what Royal Mail did was they used their data of existing bullying and harassment caseload and associated costs to help build the case to introduce mediation. The next step was to secure the support of both unions. And so really from the beginning, Royal Mail engaged the unions. They were involved from the very beginning to a briefing session, which was delivered by TCM. And they were also involved in the procurement process in choosing the mediation provider, which TCM was honored to be the selected provider. So this really means that the unions, they understood the mediation process. There was ownership engagement with the process, and that was a really, really key to the success of this scheme, which has recently begun, and really says a lot to the future success of the scheme as well. So another challenge was ensuring that the process, the mediation process, was secure and sufficient for such a large organization. As you would be aware, Royal Mail is a huge organization across the UK, about 100,000 plus employees. So they really needed a mediation service that would be flexible, adaptive, and quick to respond to needs across the country. So TCM worked closely with Royal Mail's HR shared services, and in partnership, we set up a thorough and rigorous and efficient process that was good for their business and also the employees. And so what is the impact of this mediation scheme? Well, it's still early days. It was launched in April of 2014, so we're just about 2 months in. But to date, we've had just about 12 mediation cases and 100% success rate. So we're really proud, and it's great. It's not only great for Royal Mail, but of course all of the people involved. So if that's 12 mediations, that's at least 24 people who now have had their disputes resolved through a collaborative and effective and really great process to actually address the core issues of the disputes, which we know from the beginning was one of the problems with their existing bullying and harassment policies. So the impact, again, it's new, but they're really beginning to encourage parties and employees to move towards a more informal resolution where applicable. Another great impact of this scheme is that the time taken to progress the case through mediation is significantly less than the average time to conduct a bullying harassment investigation compared to last year. So for example, we're able to assign a mediator within 24 hours and to make the mediation happen within 10 to 15 business days. So you've got a closed and self-determined and owned resolution for the dispute within less than 3 weeks of the case even being referred. So it's a really fantastic and quick process. And finally, actually, again, another great impact is what I just briefly alluded to, is that the individuals are arriving at the solution themselves. So it really, mediation builds and fosters self-determination and self-sufficiency. So in conclusion, it's a really great collaborative project between Royal Mail and TCM with great potential to have a real positive impact for both employees and the business on resolving workplace disputes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Megan. That was a really interesting insight to the work that's going on at the Royal Mail Group. I will now hand over to David, who is going to talk about the Model Resolution Policy. Thank you. David, could you unmute, please, to deliver your presentation? Thank you.
Sorry, Adam, I've been talking away at the screen here for a few minutes and they've not been able to hear me, so apologies about that. But I was just saying thank you very much to Paul and also thank you very much to Megan. And I was reflecting that it was only a couple of years ago that I was talking at the Sky Studios in Isleworth about the industrial relations landscape in Royal Mail, and it was often used as an example of worst practice in employee relations. And here we are 2 years later, holding Royal Mail as a benchmark standard, a standard bearer of good employee relations and industrial relations. And at the heart of that is the development of dialogue and cohesion as a part of dispute resolution. And at the centre of the Royal Mail approach, as with many other organisations, is mediation. So I'll spend a few moments talking about the resolution policy, and I know a number of questions are being asked, particularly about, don't we need a grievance procedure? Aren't we obliged as employers to have a grievance process? And I'll be looking forward to addressing that question. But just a short overview of the resolution policy and how this can underpin the whole system's approach to dispute resolution in your organisation. So a large number of organisations are now starting to implement resolution policy. I found out earlier in the week that a large UK bank have now embedded an issues resolution policy based on the mediation policy. A large county council have now embedded a resolution policy. A city council that I'll be talking about in a moment have embedded a resolution policy, and a large number of additional organisations are now moving away from grievance to resolution. And this is why. Well, it's based on fairness. It's about mutual respect. It's about empathy, dignity and dialogue. And these are core values that underpin the resolution policy and help the parties to unlock dialogue and conversations as a method for resolving their disputes, moving away from the approaches which I set out earlier. And when you look at your grievance procedure, which is certainly something I'd recommend doing, does your grievance procedure use any of these terms? If your grievance procedure has the word empathy written anywhere in it, please do send it through to me. I would love to see it. And I'd be delighted to put it on my website as an example of best practice. But empathy, as many people have told me, is the cement that holds us together. It's the cement of the psychological contract, the most important contract that exists in your organisation right now. So the resolution policy, a new approach to grievance and complaints resolution, it's values-based and it draws out an opportunity for the parties to reach agreement based on their interests, needs and values and beliefs rather than the strengths of their relative positions. It encourages the early triage of cases by unions, HR professionals and managers working collaboratively to identify, spot and resolve disputes early. The overwhelming focus is on the role of manager, and for those of you who've been reading my article series in HR Grapevine and other blogs and HR journals, you'll see that I've been talking about the important role that managers are playing in helping to resolve issues early. Of course, as we've heard already, the role that mediation can play in that whole systems approach. It's not the be-all and end-all, but it's a key vehicle to be able to resolve disputes early. Mediations last for one full day. I was delighted to hear Megan reporting the success rates from mediations in Royal Mail Group at 100. Checked out with ACAS a number of times. In fact, ACAS have spoken at conferences in favour and support of the resolution approach because they see that it drives common sense and it gets parties to the table and it meets the minimum standards set out in the ACAS Code of Discipline and Grievance. There's no requirement for you to have a policy called a grievance procedure as long as you meet those minimum standards, and they are just minimum standards. The policy, and you'll all receive a free copy of the policy if you've not asked for that already, we'll send that across to you. It also includes a series of toolkits for HR professional managers and employees to help bring the case to resolution. So it promotes and encourages positive relationships, it's constructive dialogue, and about managers and leaders walking the talk. And this is what organisations are saying. So there are different approaches. I won't spend too long on this. I run a number of webinars on a regular basis looking at different approaches to resolution. And as Paul Latreille has indicated, the most effective integrated conflict management systems utilise and draw upon a whole array of different approaches. Many of them are centred around mediation and coaching. However, there are, as you can see, a number of different approaches which are worth embedding into your organisations and utilising at times of conflict and dispute. So Winchester City Council, an organisation who have embedded a resolution policy, have shared with us a case study. It's quite a detailed case study, and we'll be writing it up and putting it on our website and sharing it. But here's a few of the highlights that, that they've shared with us for today's webinar. So the new policies within there, they've implemented the resolution policy and moved away from grievance. They want to have an organisation within Winchester City Council where people respect each other, where issues are resolved as soon as possible and people take responsibility for the situation and the resolution of the situation. For too long, the use of grievance has been used to abrogate responsibility on the false belief that a higher figure or a higher authority will resolve the situation for us. The best outcome a grievance can deliver for those people is an empty, hollow feeling in their tummies. This helps people take responsibility for the grievance and responsibility for the resolution. As with the case study that Megan shared from Royal Mail Group, the unions are absolutely key to this. And Winchester City Council have formed a very strong partnership and relationship with their Unison, a representative who was at an event that I was at recently within the council, and they said, overall, I think this new policy will be useful in resolving issues before they reach the stage of grievance. I sometimes think that the term grievance and the formality of the current procedures puts people off raising issues in the workplace which can fester if left unaddressed. I say, hear, hear. Absolutely right. Let's get issues resolved early and try and find a successful outcome. So here are 5 things that you might want to take away after today's webinar. The first thing is, what's the evidence of need for change in your organisation? If grievances are working fine in your organisation and the current approach works, then perhaps there's not a need for change. If, however, you find that you are experiencing low engagement, high stress, high cost, high management time, and other challenges related to grievance resolution, now might be a good time to think about changing. Thinking about the role that mediation can play, I know a number of you on the webinar are using mediation already. How can you embed it into your organisation and give it real visibility? Encouraging HR and employee relations teams to coach and mentor managers at times of conflict, change and crisis. Really supporting managers to have difficult conversations and helping them by proactively supporting them by providing the training that they need to secure better resolutions. And of course, for many organisations, number 4, developing an internal or outsourced mediation scheme is essential to that. As with Royal Mail Group and over 300 organisations that I work with, they now have access to accredited internal or outsourced mediators. So Better Resolutions, we're launching this programme on the 3rd of July, and we're very excited about this. This is a programme that I've designed for managers and leaders to help them secure better resolutions and underpin a resolution culture within your organisation. we'll send more information out, and it might be an approach that would be beneficial for some of your managers and leaders to be thinking about, building the confidence, and the courage to handle difficult situations at work. So we'll run a poll now, if we can, in terms of are you interested in developing a resolution policy? Do you see this as being a good way forward? And then what I'd like to do is to try and answer any questions, and then we'll be closing the webinar off in about 5 minutes or so. So if you have got any questions, please do feel free to do that now. Okay, I'm sure we'll see the poll results shortly. Here we go.
We have the results in now, David. I hope you can see them. We're looking like a 91% swing towards introducing a resolution policy, which is amazing news. So now,
fantastic, Alan. That's really exciting to hear, and I'd be delighted to work with those of you who are interested in developing a resolution policy to help you to make those first steps. And part of that is sharing the template TCM model policy with yourselves, which we'll do after this webinar. I'm happy to answer any questions. And of course, there's a lot more that I can say through presentations and dialogue with yourselves to help you make that shift in culture. But we do have a number of questions as well. So if I can run through the couple of questions that I've got here, and if you have got any further questions, please do feel free to ask them. If we don't have the opportunity to answer them now through the webinar, then we will give you full written responses to the questions. And just to mention as well, of course, the webinar has been recorded, so if you're interested in listening to it again or sharing it with your colleagues, please feel free to do so. In addition, we'll be getting the webinar transcribed and put online so you can read it at your leisure. So the first question, Amy, thank you very much for this, is do we not have an obligation to follow a grievance process if concerns have been raised by an employee? The obligation for the organisation is to help secure a successful outcome that meets the business needs and the needs of your employees. That's the first and primary obligation of the organisation. And that obligation can be fulfilled through creating an environment and creating the conditions for the parties to achieve a successful outcome. Promoting dialogue, encouraging mediation, helping the parties come together, upskilling managers to have difficult conversations are far more effective ways for the organisation to fulfil its obligations. The model resolution policy does incorporate the ability to investigate the situation. Of course, if it's felt to be more serious or if the parties specifically want the issues to be investigated, that can be allowed for. There is still a formal resolution meeting where the individual has right to representation. And of course, any outcome from resolution is able to be appealed by the individuals. And that happens at the end of the process, not at the beginning of the process. So the employee's rights and needs are still protected. However, the organisation focuses far more on early resolution and nipping issues in the bud. So I hope that answers the question, Amy. And I know it's a really important question. It's a question that Kent County Council really did a lot of work on when they were working to embed a resolution policy across that organisation. And I'm delighted to say that they now have embedded the policy, having explored this fully with their unions and other employees and employee reps. Sonia, thank you very much for your question. The question from Sonia is, if actions are agreed by both the parties through the mediation process and one party subsequently fails to follow through the agreed actions, what is the next step? Great question. Well, this is where having managers and HR professionals who can coach and mentor and support the parties. We're not trying to create conflict-free zones in our organisations. I would argue that conflict can be a major driver of innovation and creativity. In fact, Bruce Tuckman tells us that teams go through a storming stage, a conflict stage as part of their development. Forming, storming, norming and performing. In fact, a lot of literature is increasingly tell us that conflict, organisations, teams rather, that experience conflict, positive, constructive conflict, the kind that Paul was talking about, actually are more innovative and more productive. So the question that I would ask the organisation is, what do you do as an organisation when your employees experience challenge? Because they will. Just because they've been through a mediation process doesn't mean that they're going to be skipping through the meadow with each other, and that what they've agreed on one day will stick solidly for the rest of time. There will still be real challenges ahead. They'll still have disagreements. They still won't see eye to eye on a number of points. So the question is how do we support those parties to sustain the agreement and to build a level of resilience in their relationship so future issues can be resolved effectively. And that leads into your question, Carol, so thank you very much for that. So what kind of support is most effective for managers? Well, managers often feel stuck between a rock and a hard place. Managers are not often feeling equipped or skilled to deal with the strong emotions that conflict can throw up. In fact, when managers are recruited, they're often recruited based on their technical skills and abilities. The ability to handle tears, emotion, challenge, difficult relationships isn't a primary competence for most of our leaders. It's certainly not a competence that's embedded in a leadership framework in a great many organisations, and it should be. So the first element of support I would offer to a manager is ensure that emotional intelligence, principled negotiation, active listening skills are core competencies against which they're promoted to become managers. The second support I'd offer to those managers is ensure that the training that they receive is relevant to managing the modern workplace. I often hear the word soft skills. These aren't soft skills. These are tough skills. These are real skills that managers and leaders need to help the parties find a successful outcome to their situations, helping the parties come together, having critical conversations. The third level of support I would offer to those managers is the role that HR can play. When the manager picks up the phone to the HR professional needs to be skilled and adequately competent to be able to coach and mentor that manager to have the conversation with the employee, that the HR professional will create the conditions for that conversation to happen, that they will resource the conversation, and this is really important, that the HR professional will continue to support the manager and the employee once the conversation has been concluded. So HR managers no longer feel that they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. There is a wraparound support for the manager, recognising that these issues are difficult. They're validated through the leadership competences, they're trained in how to have these conversations, and the HR professional encourages the conversations and create the conditions. If those three levels of support could be embedded into our organisations right now, we would not see the same levels of vitriol, anger, frustration and betrayal that I see every day as a workplace mediator. So hopefully, Carol, that sets out the scene, and certainly our Better Resolutions programme is being designed specifically to help managers have these kind of conversations. Helen, thank you very much for your question. So you've mentioned here this. Megan stated that all mediations so far with Royal Mail have been successful. Are they measuring this in some way post the mediation, or is it based on no grievance being raised afterwards? Great question. So all of the mediation outcomes are monitored for a period of 12 months. The notion of success is that the parties sign an agreement between the two of them in terms of an action plan going forward. So there's a written action plan at the end of the mediation process going forward. That's evaluated immediately, and we've applied the Kirkpatrick 4-level evaluation system for the long-term measuring of the success of mediation. We monitor the effectiveness at 1, 3, 6 and 12 months at the end once mediation is concluded. That's from TCM, the mediators, but also within Royal Mail Group. We expect there to be a drop-off and we designed that into the mediation agreement. So the question that we asked the parties kind of goes back to the question Sonia asked. The question that we asked the parties is, when problems arise going down the line, what will you do differently? Critically, what have you learned from the situation that will help you have a stronger, more resilient, more effective, more sustainable relationship in the future? And the parties say to us, do you know something? We used to go out for a coffee. We used to go and talk to each other. Yeah, we used to be friends. We used to sort these things out without all of this aggro and stress. Can't we go back to that? And that happens so often. So what we do is we help the parties implement something which is intuitive to them, which is sitting down, talking and listening. And talking and listening is absolutely at the heart of this. So thank you so much for all of your questions and all of your contributions to today. If you do have any more questions, please feel free to send those through to me. We're running more and more of these webinars. It's great to have had Paul and Megan on today's webinar. I've really enjoyed listening to their experiences and their views. Oh, I can see that. And so thank you very much for that. And please do join us any future ones. But in conclusion, I think now is a great time to implement a strategic and holistic approach to dispute resolution. There is no need to have a grievance procedure. I think now is a great time to implement and embed a resolution policy and to be thinking about that change. So please do choose resolution, as so clearly many of you have done with the poll. So thank you very much. Yeah, I look forward to working with you in the future. So I'll hand over to Alan to conclude.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you to all of you who've joined us today on this anniversary of the Model Resolution Policy. I hope you found it interesting. As David said, if you have got any questions you'd like addressed after this webinar, do drop David a line, david.liddle@tcmgroup.com. And details of our next webinar will be emailed to you. Our next webinar is going to be detailing the launch of our professional early conciliation service, which is your alternative to what ACAS is making compulsory when people approach tribunal. So please do join us for that webinar. Get in touch by email if you wish, and as David said, choose resolution. Thank you very much.